Shalom and good day, people. Welcome back to the Contrarian Podcast. It's me, Cameron, and we've been trucking along through this multi-ethnicity stuff. So yesterday, I have given you a big, long review. Essentially, I mean, not review. It was actually a rather succinct view of the sort of Hebraic biblical perspective of ethnicity. And to sort of summarize it, it's looking at just the entire broad biblical narrative. Salvation involves being called out of the nations and into the covenant life of Israel, and that is through the shedding of Messiah's blood. So it involves basically a change in ethnicity, a sort of ethnomorphosis, if you will. I don't really want to coin that term, but it accurately describes sort of what happens as you essentially are grafted into the tree of Israel. You are no longer a Gentile. You in every way, shape, and form start to hold fast to the covenants of Israel. You get every single bit of the things that have been promised to Israel by God, and it is an everlasting covenant, so it lasts forever, and it will, and it of course is ratified in the Messiah's blood. There's a few things we didn't cover in that actually rather robust view of an hour and 7-minute long sort of laying out of this idea. Is that it? I didn't cover a couple of topics we really could have gone into. It's maybe one, the bride of Messiah or the bride of God. And we could look into that later. And two, we could look at things like the ratification of the new covenant in Messiah's blood. We could look at some of Jesus's words for those things. For today, we got to, I think, sort of shift gears. I'm not going to as much present my view, but I will present you with the view that I once took when I was more of a young staff in InterVarsity. And it is still it's the view that is taught today to all staff. It is the view that is taught to students as well. And so what today I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to really give that argument that they give well for multi-ethnicity. And it's going to be a bit hard for me because, again, I'm going to probably give counter arguments as I go, but I should probably just wait till the end to do that. So again, I guess I have to always say it. I don't think I'm 100% correct in my thinking, right? If you saw yesterday, that is a very lengthy, systematic view of ethnicity. And I don't think I'm 100% right. I'm really ready and open to correction. But more importantly, I think I want you, the viewer, to sort of test these things for yourself. Don't just trust me on these things because as we're going to find out, I'll give a kind of anecdote to my life. Is I definitely believed these things at one time. And you could say, in a sort of way, for years, probably from like 2012 to like 2017, I was what you could call woke. And by woke, I will just say you believe what they're telling you, I guess. Everything that you're told about, race, ethnicity, and current race relations and what is being said, you automatically are going to believe it. And so, I mean, I guess, and then to say what my friends and I would say, there is a period where you become post-woke, I suppose, where you are more skeptical of the sort of theologies, doctrines, and things being pushed within the church, the evangelical world, or even more. And you might question some of these teachings, particularly I think when it comes to ethnicity and racial relations and things like that. And it sort of means that you don't essentially buy into the theology that has been prescribed to you anymore. Which, I mean, outside of the church world, that's just, it's pretty much the same thing, right? There's like a media narrative, and then there's a different narrative, right? And so if you don't buy into that media narrative, you are not woke anymore, I suppose, as it goes. So I'm going to get into a timeline of events as I understand them within InterVarsity. All right. So this is a guess. This isn't based in any fact. This is as I see what has unfolded in the past 10 years, sort of as I understand it. So let's start from the beginning. 2010 around, or 2009, this is a rumor that some other staff have told me, is that about that year there was some internal strife with minority staff in InterVarsity and the leadership of InterVarsity. And it sounded like it was pretty bad from what happened, that a lot of staff sort of threatened to leave. And it might have been about this sort of majority-minority crisis or conflict that was going on within the ministry. But something happened, and it was rather big. After that, so that's also the year I got saved, by the way. And I don't really know anything about InterVarsity. 2011, it's in even my fellowship, a multi-ethnicity talk is given at my chapter. And my chapter was like 80 to 100 students at my alma mater. After that talk, the numbers went down to like 40, like 30 or 40. And they haven't ever gotten up to that since, when we talk about the weekly gatherings. And you could sort of interpret it as I interpreted it, was like, okay, those people that sort of left were part of white flight, or they were on the wrong side of history, or they weren't apt to understand these concepts. I didn't understand that at the time, right? I'm a really new Christian at that time. But later, when I'm talking to my chapter as a chapter leader, as a chapter student leader, that's how I interpreted those events, is that it was like essentially white flight, and that people really didn't want to talk about ethnicity. To the other year, 2013 in InterVarsity, Ethnicities Matters is a video that is produced and published, and it lays out a non-colorblind view of the gospel, and it lays out this biblical narrative, which we'll get into really quick. Well, not really quick, that's the main point of this video, but it gets into this view of not being colorblind, of recognizing people's ethnicities, and really working towards ethnic-specific ministries. All right, moving on. 2014 is the year of the Ferguson riots. And this is something I started to write a second follow-up theological paper, which was more of a critique on multi-ethnicity. And the Ferguson riots happened in August of 2014, which is 100 years exactly, pretty much to the date, after World War I really ramps up. And this is just something I find interesting. It's not necessarily, I'm not going to try to read into it too much, but World War I, of course, it started at the end of July, where Austria declared war, but really the first fighting started happening in August, when Germany declared war on France and Russia, and England intervened. But what really marks the start of the First World War is it is a brand new kind of warfare that has never been seen before. We're talking about walls of lead and bullets, machine guns, grenades, cannons that launch multi-ton shells that can level fortresses, The world hadn't seen things like this because before this it was like cavalry charge, sort of charge of the Light Brigade, Napoleonic era things. And the amount of life lost in like September alone of the first year of the First World War, it's astronomical because these people went to war with weapons in which they did not understand. And suddenly, all these old tactics and everything, it just doesn't work. Year 2014, exactly 100 years later in August, Michael Brown is shot, and the following protests and riots start to happen, and it seems to be based around race and the black community's relation to police brutality. And these riots spread across the country, and it of course, the start of Black Lives Matter. It's the start of what we are still experiencing today. And there's a mass, media campaign, and it's almost as if a war started, and suddenly people did not know the weapons that they have and what they're capable of. And everybody's scrambling to the front, and nobody really, we're talking about where the weapons are social media and, propaganda in a lot of sense, and teachings and all these things. And we're in an information era, right? And so, of course, the weapons of war are information. And, like, how are you going to use information over one another? And, of course, InterVarsity gets embroiled into this war, and they didn't even really, I don't know if they wanted to or not, but, eventually they do, and we can see it as it goes. Because from the year 2013, 2015, these are around the year that I start working on InterVarsity staff. 2014 is when I interned. And that is when I hear, of course, the talk on multiethnicity at an orientation of new staff. And, of course, they're like, yeah, it's a word we made up, but it's really important and it really matters. And a lot of different training. Almost every single student conference I go to and staff conference between these years, it seems to focus in a large part about ethnicity. Well, my first regional conference that I went to, it was about racial reconciliation, and it was in a large part about these about race relations and things beyond that. At the end of 2015, Black Lives Matter is directly and indirectly endorsed as a prophetic movement at Urbana 2015. There is a Black Lives Matter movement speaker from the main stage. The worship leaders wore Black Lives Matter shirts. And there was a lot of backlash in 2015, but InterVarsity doubled down, and they said they believed this was the right thing to do. After the year 2015, InterVarsity Press publishes a slew of books, very much in the response to these sort of events happening. We're talking about Beyond Colorblind, a lot of ethnic-specific books like Rescuing the Gospel from Cowboys, Roadmap for Reconciliation. All these books are not only sent to staff, but encouraged to be read by staff so that they can understand these things further. Also in that year, I suppose I should say, Donald Trump is elected, which is, we should probably say, is pretty momentous in the country because of how divisive it becomes. And I think even in InterVarsity, it's a rather divisive thing because you have people saying, like, if you voted for Trump, you are racist, these sort of things. I this is about the time period that I'm getting off of places like Facebook just because of how, I guess, one-sided conversations have become. Then we get to 2018, and Urbana 18 happens. So Urbana 15 is the biggest, I think I'm probably wrong in saying this, but I think Urbana 15 is the largest attended Urbana conference in history, and it's 16,000 around attendance. Urbana 18, you could say, in the terms of box office results, is a flop. It's about 10,000 attendance. The stadium is empty. And this is just my opinion, but they doubled down on this sort of woke church narrative. And from the main stage, which is pretty much all I saw because I'm working a lot at Urbana 18, it is mostly activism being preached. Activism with a thinly guised gospel. And that's just my opinion. And so I'm frustrated with InterVarsity at that point. This is around the year, 2016, 17 is the years that I'm starting to actually break into my own thinking about this and away from sort of the InterVarsity taught thinking. So Urbana 18's a flop. They lose millions of dollars, by the way. So donors and whoever else is funding this mission conference, it's in the hole, and it might not happen again. That's just my guess. 2019, it's years later, InterVarsity finally publishes a theological position paper on ethnic reconciliation and justice, and it's published in September of 2019. And it affirms essentially all the actions that InterVarsity has taken up until this point. Now we're in the year 2020, and we're at the race riots. InterVarsity is emailing, but they're walking a very thin line. They're recognizing that on one hand, you have a very Christ-centered gospel, as they say. And on the other hand, there is the liberation gospel. And within the fellowship, they're kind of coming to head. This liberation gospel is meeting with this gospel, which has just been traditionally preached in campus ministries, and it's not looking great. But I feel like I'm just sort of sitting on the sidelines. I hear people are talking. I can't confirm anything. I'm basically, as it turns out, I'm bottom of the bottom when it comes to any decisions within InterVarsity. So I'm just sort of I'm an observer, but I'm an interested observer in what is going on because I work for InterVarsity, and as you know, I am I like InterVarsity. This is a ministry that I got saved in. I think that in a lot of ways it does the work of God on campus, but in many ways it doesn't, and I think this is one of those ways. And so I like InterVarsity. I don't want to see it go down this path of destruction, but maybe it has to. Who knows? So that's sort of the timeline of as I see it in this multi-ethnicity sort of unfolding in InterVarsity, and I would love to break apart the Ethnicity Matters video, as well as we're going to eventually break down the commitment of ethnic reconciliation and justice too. So we'll break those down at another time. But for this particular video, I am going to try and steelman InterVarsity's multi-ethnicity argument as I used to understand it, and so I'll try to give it a good rundown so that you can understand it. You'll see how it differs from my view in a bit. So to start off, InterVarsity also uses the term ethnos for nations, but it also uses it for ethnicity, which is how it brands multi-ethnicity. And the way that they see it, particularly in, Jesus onward, is there are people of many different tribes and tongues that come to worship Jesus. We're talking about essentially the ministry of the early church onward to where we're at today. It's been a multi-ethnic ministry because the gospel's for everyone. And so it reaches people all over the globe. It crosses cultures. It calls people out of sin and into a relationship with God. And it, so we see that the church is a multi-ethnic church. So multi-ethnicity is, of course, it's got to be a biblical value because across the world, people are following Jesus. And, so, I've seen Chinese churches, I've seen churches, and some of the people that seem to like love Jesus the most. I see worship service in different languages, and Catholic Mass down in Mexico, and all sorts of just different ways that the gospel has gone forth among the nations. And you can see it, and it's a very, as you could say, syncretized gospel. It understands the culture, and then it tries to relate. It's trying to get people to understand like Jesus through a lens that they can understand it. And it's massive. The gospel goes forth, and you see this picture in, of course, Revelation 7 verses 9 and 10. And it's, after these things, look, behold, a great multitude which no one could count, from every nation, all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne of the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands. And they cry with a loud voice, saying, Salvation to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. So here, as they would say, at the end, there are people of different tribes, tongues, and nations all worshiping before the throne. And so they say, like, yeah, this great feast is going to happen, and there's going to be Korean food, and there's going to be Mexican food, and there's going to be German sausages, and all these things are just going to be at the wedding feast, and people are going to be speaking all these different languages, and it's going to be this cultural, huge, world dinner almost. And that's the view of Revelation 7 verses 9 and 10. And this is just right before the throne of Jesus. And so we see that at the end, that these people that all the tribes, tribes, and nations are going to be there. So we ought to start reflecting that sort of in our churches and ministries now. So you have to sort of work towards a cultural affirming view of the gospel almost. And that is because we have to look sort of at the creation of culture and ethnicity. And the creation of culture and ethnicity happens at the Tower of Babel. When they start to make bricks and they want to make the Tower of Babel, and they will see, well, let's make a name for ourselves, otherwise we'll be scattered among the whole earth. And so in Genesis chapter 11, verses 6 through 9, and the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the whole earth. And so the view here is that God confused their language not as a curse, but as a way to get people back on track, because the way in which people started to make a name for themselves, it was going to be this big huddle. And God, of course, commanded people to go forth and multiply over the whole earth. And this is, of course, after Noah's flood, when the whole earth is already destroyed again. So it's also God holding back on not destroying the human race yet again. And instead, he confuses their language and he scatters them. And this is essentially the creation of the ethnos, of the nations, because now people only gather together, have the same language and culture, and then languages sort of inadvertently created, culture and nations are inadvertently created by God. And so because of those things, you ought to understand that people have different ethnicities, right? And you have to recognize those things. But beyond that, there are cultural connotations that are tied with those ethnic values. Language, food, and different cultural customs and practices within cultures. They're part of something that God has made. And so this gets back to this is a four circles teaching of the sort of racial reconciliation. So Four Circles is it's a gospel presentation that InterVarsity uses. I don't use it anymore because I find a lot of problems with it. But we're not gonna break apart Four Circles. We're gonna break apart how InterVarsity talks about racial reconciliation with Four Circles. And so in the first circle, in the gospel presentation, it means created for good. And when talking about ethnicity, your ethnic heritage was created for good. So I mean, I'm French Canadian. It's like fur trappers in the St. Lawrence Valley, I suppose, and they really mixed in with the natives there, and sort of a very social liberal mindset among French Canadians, and it still persists to this day. Other things too, like Irish. I mean, I have a very big Irish and Italian background, and there's this incredible adherence to Catholicism in my family from those backgrounds. It's almost like Irish Catholic and Italian Catholic. Very, very, I mean, even French Catholic too, I suppose. Very tied to the old European sort of church system within my family. Different family customs, Christmas pickle and lasagna and other things. So recognizing just like amazing things that are in your culture and affirming that those things were created by God. Then the view is that it's damaged by evil. And this gets into those sort of racial, I hate to say it, but stereotypes in a lot of ways. When they talk about this, it is a lament over the brokenness of ways that people have hurt each other over ethnic things. So, slavery, Hotel Rwanda, these sort of things, Holocaust, genocide just in general, these sort of broken things, but even broken things within people's own ethnicities. That includes, let's just take Irish and like a love for whiskey and drunkenness. Okay, and this is not just me, but we talk about these things and have lamented about them in the past within InterVarsity. There's this one. I just hesitate to say it because I feel like I'll be branded something, but some black staff are like single black homes, absent black parents. In Native circles, it was heart disease and the sort of way in which sort of the government surplus food has really poisoned a whole generation. In other circles, like Asian circles, it was a drive to succeed, doctor or lawyer. And it falls in these racial stereotypes within sort of brokenness, sort of things that you can sort of recognize cultural brokenness, but even between groups, how it's broken. And so then you get to the point where actually Jesus sort of redeems your ethnicity. It is a recognition of the brokenness of your ethnicity, turning away from those things, but sort of embracing the good things. And beyond that, you move towards a racial reconciliation mindset where you, like in the 60s during the civil rights, there would be white Christian people that drove black voters to vote, and they would be killed. It's other things like the Reconciliation Committee in Rwanda that over this sort of cultural genocide. Like, how do you reconcile as a nation people that just killed each other, family members dead, unless it's through the gospel lens? You have to first be leveled by Jesus. And so they say, at the foot of the cross can the oppressor and the oppressed stand together as equals. And they'll say these sort of things when it comes to sort of ethnic conflict and crisis that have happened. And so Jesus is, of course, the only way to get this sort of reconciliation. Because if you try it in your own, you need to be redeemed by Jesus first in order to see these things happen. So it's of course a roadmap to reconciliation as they'll lay it out. And a lot of these things are, that's essentially the view of ethnicity. And so it involves recognizing people's race. It involves affirming cultural practices as being created by good, created for good. And it involves just in general a sort of a race affirming, culture affirming view of the gospel. So that is the InterVarsity view of multiethnicity. As you can probably tell, it runs contrarian podcast to my view of ethnicity. And I'm going to counter with a few points today. We'll probably talk about this more in depth later. The first is that I personally reject the idea that God created cultures. In fact, I believe that all cultures, except for the one culture that God has ordained, are idolatrous and in rebellion to God. Absolutely. There is only one way which God has prescribed to live, and that was to the nation Israel. And so to all the other nations, they act as though this isn't like a superiority thing, but they their cultural practices are sort of affirmed, and you can see this at like the woman at the well, and it's like, well, our followers worship on this mountain. How come you say they have to worship God in Jerusalem? Or the Samaritan is the one being called the neighbor by Jesus when they're asked like, who is my neighbor? And so obviously it's really embroiled in the gospel. But really, Jesus' view is repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. And he's coming for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So I don't think that cultures are created for good. That is a improper assumption on InterVarsity's part, that cultures were created for good. Is an improper assumption that Babel and the occurrences that happened at Babel were a overall good thing. Yes, it did get humanity back on track, but the idea was so that he could, start to redeem the earth through one family. And it wasn't to redeem them so that they could stay in their sin. It was redeem them to call them into Israel, because Israel is a kingdom of priests, and they really failed at that job at the initial start of the covenant. But now you are sort of a Kohanim of priests beyond that. Let's go back to Revelation. So they're never gonna read this one to you, because it's Revelation 7, 9, and 10. It's what they're all gonna shout as they talk about multi-ethnicity. All tribes, tongues, and peoples are worshiping before the throne. First of all, this is before any of the seals or any of the before the world is even judged. It's before the day of Adonai. It's before the day of the Lord even happens. So this is before the earth is sort of laid bare in its sins and is judged accordingly. And it's of course before Jesus' earthly reign returned to the world. It's sort of this picture of what people say it looks like now and in heaven. They're going to skip over the Revelation 5, 9, and 10. And so here it is, Revelation 5, 9. And they sang a new song, saying, "Worthy are you to take the book and break its seals, for you were slain and purchased for God with your blood men from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom of priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth." So it's almost like Revelation 5, 9, and 5, 10 are more affirming to my view, because it says that you've been bought by God and Messiah's blood. to become a nation of priests. So you've been bought from the tribes, tongues, and nations, and you've brought into becoming essentially priests in the order of Melchizedek, as Hebrews would lay out in a very lengthy conversation. So you're to be a kingdom of priests, and Israel was supposed to be a kingdom of priests to the nations, to have them understand what it really looks like to follow God, to follow him in the God-ordained culture that is Torah, which is offered. And anything else is, of course, going to be idolatrous. It's not of God. It is of something else. It is of Satan in a lot of ways. So you can't say something like, I mean, French-Canadian bacon, right? Oh, it's delicious, right? Would Jesus really affirm, like, me eating French-Canadian bacon? Of course, there's going to be debate about this, but there are syncretistic things that I strongly disagree with that InterVarsity uses as almost justification for pushing this multi-ethnic narrative. So let's say, like, okay, German hymnals and, like, the organ, right? These are things invented in, like, the German church, and, you know, printing press and having Bibles. These are sort of things that have been gone out, and it's like we don't worship in synagogues or stuff anymore. We worship in churches, and we worship on Sunday, and all these things. And they say there's all these different syncretized things within the church already, almost as justification for the cultural way to worship God. And look, I'm not going to knock, I mean, I will knock some of those things, but I'm not going to knock somebody who's really trying to worship God and maybe doesn't understand. I mean, nobody knows Hebrew really in America. There are quite a few people that do. I'm sorry, that's a bold assumption. You know, we're not going to be able to read the Greek and Hebrew. You know, we're not going to be able to sing the Hallel hymns that Jesus was singing. And so we have, of course, layers of culture within the church, and they almost use those layers of culture within the church to justify culture as a whole. And so things like Christmas, you know, it was something that the church syncretized so that it could appeal to the Germanic pagan peoples during Yule. You know, let's have a feast about the Son of God during these times. Different cultural affirmation things, which I think just run contrary to God's word, is something like Dia de los Muertos, or All Saints Day, or All Souls Day. Catholic, Latino-embraced ideas, which, you know, flagrantly go in the face of Torah as worship of the dead. Even in Chinese circles, I mean, I was actually really surprised because it's like burning incense to the dead, right? That these things are ritualistic in some nature, and there's been problems in evangelism over the years coming in conflict with all these things. And, you know, you discover these things in an evangelical mindset that it's really tough to cross cultures. And what I will say is InterVarsity is good at training people to cross cultures well. What they mix up is they mix up a ethnicity with culture, and they equate them to the same thing. And I've been to numerous conferences where it's an ethnic-specific conference, and they'll say you can be like high-identifying Native or low-identifying Native. And what is that supposed to mean? Like, as a high-identifying Native means like you really connect to the ethnic and cultural practices of Native Americans and the language, and then low identifying is you don't, and they sort of have to come into conflict with their own ideas within their own conferences, because it's like, oh yes, like I burn sage and all these things, and I'll let out war cries and all these. It gets really hairy really quick. Because when you're talking about syncretized things, it can start to run into paganism in a lot of ways. And they are, in these ethnic-specific ministries, they're constantly threading that line. So, that is a bit of a running against the sort of InterVarsity multi-ethnicity narrative. It's not a full picture, as I would want to say it, but it is it's as best as I can do to present you with the InterVarsity argument as best I can. Again, I haven't really read the books. I'm not going to look at what the liberation gospel really looks like too much, so maybe I need to bring someone on here who really looks at those things in this way. But it's overly complicated in a lot of ways, and it breeds this rampant paganism within the church, because there has to be a line which you draw which will say this is not of God. And so suddenly, once you start to draw those lines, then you can become labeled a racist in some ways. So it's a really difficult path to walk. And anybody who is walking on these eggshells currently, my heart goes out to you, because it's tough. I understand. I've just sort of chosen to distance myself entirely from the InterVarsity nationally as basically a whole, but even beyond that, I don't want my students to go to conferences which they're going to openly preach these things. We'll discuss some implications further about what the sort of multi-ethnic justice, racial reconciliation, how it practically and pragmatically plays out, because right now we're just talking about abstracts, and even with my sort of restoration identity Israel view of the gospel, we're going to talk about pragmatic ways that this sort of goes forth. But I'm already going 40 minutes. I didn't imagine I was going to go this far. I was thinking about only going 20 minutes, but we'll look at these things further. So really, thank you for joining me today as we really start to talk and dig into these problems a bit further. But I really appreciate you joining me today. If you can, I really would like if you could like and subscribe to my channel and like this video. I'm doing this sort of for fun, but I don't think it's really for fun. I really think God is telling me you really have to say something during these times, because these times are actually kind of crazy and lines are being drawn in the sand all over the place. And I want to be able to present a clear view of what I say. And of course, I'm going to get detractors. There are plenty of people in the evangelical world that are against a Hebraic viewpoint. So, that we can have that discussion. We can cross that bridge when we get to it. But I really need to sort of say these things, because InterVarsity is a ministry I care about. And they're walking towards their own destruction as far as I see it. This blatant embrace of pagan ideology is going to be their downfall, as it was with Israel and Judah. As with those places, they built their high places, and they married the Moabites, and they did all that they. Well, as Corinthians would put it, they've joined themselves with the Gentiles. They've joined themselves with unbelievers in a lot of ways, and that only leads to your own destruction. The Bible lays it out very clear. You can't join with unbelievers, even in the smallest sense. So, I'm preaching from the place where, everybody's talking about a syncretic gospel. What does it look like to be like a Mexican follower of Jesus or a native follower of Jesus? Those are the prevalent ones in my area. That's why I say them more, because I'm more in the Southwest, and there are a lot of Native Americans and a lot of Latino Americans. And so those are the places we talk about. But so we can, of course, look into those things, right? But I'm going to, of course, say, I have a desyncretized gospel. And that means, I'm going back to the original Hebrew idea, as I mentioned yesterday in yesterday's video. I don't want the layers of culture or understanding to be a hindrance to what I view as the truth. So I guess to close, please like and subscribe. Thank you for joining, and I will see you again tomorrow. Shalom and blessings upon you. Thank you.